Hi, I'm Nate Rada. Welcome to today's Uncovering Pittsburgh Stories video. Today, we're going to be talking about portraits of jazz, Pittsburgh jazz, with one of our docents at the History Center, Judy Sutton. We recorded this video last week, so in just a second, we're going to switch over to that and start. So all of these portraits, or all of these people, are featured in our new exhibit at the History Center on the Smithsonian's Portraits of Pittsburgh. I hope that you are able to join us and see the exhibit in person. Some of the portraits we're going to be looking at today are a little bit different than the ones in the exhibit, but they are all of the same people. So that said, I'm going to start our video, and I hope you enjoy Judy's presentation.
Pittsburgher Jamal said jazz is America's classical music. Did you realize that our own Pittsburgh area played an important part in its development? Jazz was born in New Orleans around 1900. It was the musical product of the multicultural influences of Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Jazz emerged from New Orleans and migrated up the Mississippi on riverboats and the railroads to cities like Detroit, Kansas City, Chicago, New York, and Pittsburgh. Once jazz got to Pittsburgh, it really took hold. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there was an influx of African Americans from the South into Pittsburgh. These people came for a better life and to escape the brutal Jim Crow laws of the southern states. Quite a few of these emigres would have had musical training in the traditional classical manner. During the first decade of the 20th century, there were 10 orchestras in Pittsburgh comprised of African American musicians. These musicians were among the first Pittsburghers to hear and then recreate the exciting new style of music just beginning to be called jazz. When the first notes of Pittsburgh jazz were played, they were played by accomplished musicians for audiences with high expectations. In 1908, these African American musicians founded Local 471 of the American Federation of Musicians. 471 evolved to become the social hub of Pittsburgh's African American musicians and fostered a culture of passing it on. Among the things they passed on were high expectations, and among those who were mentored by these musicians were artists who became catalysts for evolutionary change in the music. Let's look at the lives of 5 of these musicians who had their early training here and never really left Pittsburgh behind. The first musician that we're going to talk about is Billy Eckstine, who was a vocalist and band leader. Billy was born in 1914 in Pittsburgh, and he lived for a time in the Highland Park neighborhood and attended Peabody High School, but transferred to Armstrong High School in Washington, D.C., from which he graduated and went on to attend St. Paul Normal and Industrial School and then Howard University. He had been honing his musical talent throughout his teens, winning numerous amateur contests as he developed the velvet voice and the smooth, distinctive vibrato for which he later became famous. Dropping out of college, Billy launched his professional career in the mid-1930s, first in a Buffalo nightclub and later at Chicago's Club de Lisa, where Earl Hines saw him and hired Billy for his Grand Terrace Ballroom Orchestra in 1939. His popular nickname, Mr. B, did not emerge until years later after his big band and bebop experiences had segued into his long individual singing career. Billy remained with the Heinz band until 1943, primarily as a vocalist, but also played trumpet and trombone. In 1944, he formed and led the first bebop big band, attracting a number of outstanding musicians, including Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and Sarah Vaughan, all of whom had also been with Earl Hines. As musical tastes changed after World War II, Billy Eckstine disbanded his group in 1947 and returned to solo performing. From the late 1940s onward, he gained ever greater crossover appeal, and his career prospered through the 1950s and 60s, fueled by record contracts, TV variety show appearances, and both United States and European touring. Hit songs associated with Billy Eckstine over his long career include I Apologize, My Foolish Heart, Skylark, Everything I Have Is Yours, and Prisoner of Love. And let's listen to a little bit of Billy singing I Apologize.
If I told a lie, if I made you cry, when I said goodbye, I'm sorry. From the bottom of my heart, dear, I apologize.
Billy continued to perform into the 1980s, and critics have noted that his considerable impact as a jazz innovator and pop performer might have been even greater had he not been limited by the racial and social attitudes of the time. The recipient of awards and recognition during his lifetime, he received 2 Grammy Awards after his death in 1993. And now let's talk about Mary Lou Williams, a pianist and composer. Mary Lou Williams grew up in the East Liberty section of Pittsburgh, exhibiting natural piano talent in early childhood. Mary Lou's teacher was her mother, who was a piano player in their local church. Often playing at parties for prominent local families, Mary Lou became known as the Little Piano Girl. From the mid-1920s and through the 1930s, she performed on the road and then worked as a big band arranger for Louis Armstrong, the Dorsey Brothers, Benny Goodman, Cab Calloway, Bob Crosby, and Glenn Gray. 1941 saw her traveling with and writing and arranging for Duke Ellington, until later in the 1940s she moved to New York City, where jazz creativity was on the upswing, spurred by the likes of Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, and Thelonious Monk. And let's listen to a little of Mary Lou's music. When Mary Lou Williams parted company with many of her fellow jazz artists within her growth as a composer, she wrote over 350 works, with the long piece, The Zodiac Suite, a notable example. It began as a 12-part exploration at the astrological signs on her weekly radio show, and ultimately, after she rearranged several sections, she joined the New York Philharmonic in performing the Zodiac Suite at Carnegie Hall. After 3 years in the expat jazz scene of Paris, she returned to New York in 1955, where life took another unique turn. She became a Roman Catholic, ceased performing, and spent the next 15 to 20 years involved in religious and charitable work. Not forgetting her Pittsburgh heritage, however, she was involved in creating the Pittsburgh Jazz Festival in 1964. During this period, her religious emphasis led to the composition of the notable hymn in honor of St. Martin de Porres, as well as 3 complete masses. Her Mary Lou's Mass was commissioned by the Vatican and had its premiere in Pittsburgh in 1973. Mary Lou Williams' style expanded throughout her career, developing from big band swing piano in the 1930s through bebop in the 1940s and on into the greater complexities of the avant-garde in the 1960s, retaining the status of modernist over the years. She died in 1981 and is buried in Calvary Cemetery in Pittsburgh. And now we're going to talk about Billy Strayhorn, a pianist and composer. Growing up on Cuyahoga Street in Homewood, Billy Strayhorn expressed musical genius early in life, both in classical and jazz genres, in both performance and composition. While still a student at Westinghouse High School, he began incorporating jazz and classical elements in his compositions. After high school, his ongoing musical education included classical study at Pittsburgh Musical Institute, and he acknowledged the influence of jazz musicians such as Art Blakey and Earl Fatha Hines. In 1935, when he was 20, Billy saw his own review, Fantastic Rhythm, produced at Westinghouse High School. He had composed the book, music, and lyrics. Life for Billy Strayhorn changed completely in 1938 when he had the opportunity to play for Duke Ellington when the latter was visiting Pittsburgh. With great flair and originality, Billy played Elliot's Sophisticated Lady, as well as his own Lush Life, which he had composed while still a teen, and which later became one of his signature pieces. This informal audition led to Billy joining Ellington as a collaborator and participating in a symbiotic musical partnership of nearly 3 decades. Some of Billy Strayhorn's own hits included Take the A Train, the song that would become Ellington Band's signature number, as well as Johnny Come Lately and Chelsea Bridge. Let's listen to Billy Strayhorn playing with Duke Ellington's band. The collaboration of the two men was so seamless that experts still cannot establish the exact extent of Strayhorn's contribution to the Ellington repertoire. In addition to jazz hits, the two produced such works as the Deep South Suite and the Shakespearean Suite during the 1940s and 50s. During his productive and influential, if brief, career, Billy Strayhorn not only worked with Duke Ellington, but also continued to create, coach, arrange, and perform independently, receiving numerous honors. Upon his death in 1967, Ellington mourned the loss of my right arm, left foot, eyes, stomach, and soul. In tribute, Ellington recorded a collection of Billy's compositions titled "And His Mother Called Him Bill." Now we're going to talk about Earl Fatha Hines, a jazz pianist. In the early 20th century, as a member of a very musical family in Duquesne, PA, Earl Hines flirted with the trumpet and cornet as a youngster, but switched to piano under the tutelage of his stepmother. He soon began to study classical piano and in his early teens moved to nearby Pittsburgh to attend Chantilly High School while living with his aunt. In his Pittsburgh formative years, he moved quickly from school to Wiley Avenue's Leader House, a local club, where he accompanied band leader vocalist Lois Depp. He and Depp became the first African-American performers to play on radio station KDKA in 1921. Still in the early 1920s, Earl's next career transition took him from Pittsburgh to Chicago, with the encouragement from well-known jazzman Eugene Blake. His initial engagement at a new club, the Elite Number 2, was followed by an invitation to play with the Carol Dickerson Band at a larger venue, then to a national tour with Dickerson in 1925, and to his first meeting with Louis Armstrong. He soon teamed with Armstrong and other musicians at a series of Chicago jazz clubs. And let's listen to Earl Hines play a little. 1928, Earl Hines was debuting with his own big band at Chicago's Grand Terrace Ballroom, where he remained producing hit records through the 1930s and on into the late 40s. The band became nationally known as a result of the Terrace Group coast-to-coast radio broadcast beginning in 1934, and it may have been during this period that he acquired the nickname Fatha. Among his new hires during the big band era were Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Billy Eckstine, and Sarah Vaughan, all part of the constantly shifting jazz scene. As the big band era was ending, Hines went on to tour Europe with Louis Armstrong, then to form his own Dixieland band, and in the mid-1960s to play with a jazz combo organized by the United States State Department for a goodwill tour of Russia. Earl Hines' playing featured an innovative trumpet style that led him to be called the father of modern jazz piano, and to inspire numerous others such as Teddy Wilson, Nat King Cole, Count Basie, and Art Tatum. In his later years, he continued to play at small venues until the weekend before his death. The inscription at his California gravesite reads simply, Piano Man. Now, let's talk a little bit about Art Blakey, a drummer. Art Blakey was born in Pittsburgh in 1919 and lived in the Hill District. He taught himself to play the piano and the drums, and in his early teens, Art organized a big band to play at dances. He was playing piano with a group at a local club when Earl Garner showed up and replaced him at the piano. This was the key career turn for Blakey, as he then took over the band's drum kit. Art's first big break came in the autumn of 1942 when Mary Lou Williams hired him to play with her band at Kelly's Stable in New York City. Fletcher Henderson heard him and hired Art to tour with him in 1943 and 44. Art was then offered a chance to play with the new Billy Eckstine Big Band, which was a breeding ground for bebop and included such luminaries as Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, and Sarah Vaughan. In 1948, Art traveled to Africa to learn about Islamic culture, and while there learned the techniques of African drumming. He then began using his elbow on the tom-tom and tapping out rhythms on the side of the drum. And let's listen to a little bit of Art playing the drums. To Art, jazz was American music, and there was nothing like it anywhere on the planet. In the late 1940s, Art formed the Jazz Messengers, which became a training ground for young musicians. He was the driving force behind the hard bop movement of the 1950s and was instrumental in bringing drums to the forefront of the music, making percussion an integral part of the melody. On the road, Blakey was indefatigable. Even when growing deafness made it difficult to hear the soloist, he continued to outswing musicians half his age. Music, he told his audience, is supposed to wash away the dust of everyday life from your feet. And now that you've learned a little bit about the lives of these musicians, we invite you to visit the Smithsonian Portraits of Pittsburgh at the Senator John Heinz History Museum to see the actual portraits. Thank you.
Judy, thanks for sharing your presentation with us. That was really interesting and informative.
You're very welcome. We did have a little bit of trouble with the audio on Art Blakey, but I think you got an idea of what a spectacular drummer the man was.
Yeah, and I think that one of my colleagues was able to put that link to that YouTube video in the chat. So hopefully, if you weren't able to listen to it then, you can listen to it in just a few moments. So if you have any questions for Judy, feel free to ask in the chat. And I'll start off with one, Judy, to give people a couple of moments to come up with a question or two for you. So my question is, what's one way that you learned about these jazz musicians? Like, I know you've been interested in Pittsburgh jazz for a while and have done research in a couple of different ways. So what's one way you found to be really helpful or really interesting in your research?
Well, of course, I'm old enough that I knew about these musicians. But the thing that really got me going was, and I realized the date when I started looking it up, was 7 years ago. There was a woman working at Hines at the time who has since passed away named Sandra Baker, and felt that we needed to do something at Hines about Pittsburgh jazz. So she formed a committee. And I thought, how cool, because I don't know a whole lot, but I love music. So I became part of the committee. So the committee, there were people that were more knowledgeable than I. So we came up with 10 musicians that we felt we really had to start with. You've seen 5 of them. There were actually 5 more. And we started doing biographies of the musicians, finding information about them. We were going to the idea was to put it together as part of an ambassador talk. Heinz History Center has people that go out and talk in the community as part of the Ambassador Talk program about different aspects of Western Pennsylvania history. And of course, jazz is an important part of it. So while we were doing this, we started talking about the fact that you can't just talk about jazz musicians, you have to hear the music. So how were we going to do that? So the man that was in charge of it at the time, Alan James, had been at California University of Pennsylvania. He brought in Max Ganano, who had been a music professor and head of the music department. And what happened is they brought in the technology music students from Cal, who figured out a way to make music part of the presentation. So what they ended up doing was doing basically little videos, think Ken Burns, so little vignettes. So I really learned a lot. And I remember we did a program, and afterwards, this would probably have been a couple of months afterwards, a man that I know said to me that he had never listened to jazz much before the program, because not only did we talk about the history of jazz in Pittsburgh, but Max also talks about what you need to listen to in jazz. So it inspired this gentleman to start listening to jazz. So I hope in that way we were able to make people aware of it. I have certainly learned a lot. I am no expert, but it's been fun learning about these people and how difficult it was, especially when you get into women in jazz. When Mary Lou was on the road, you know, that's just not what women did. Not only that, but the fact is you're traveling probably in a bus or by train. At the end of it, this is the 1930s and 40s, the woman had to look glamorous even if she was exhausted. And she was also traveling with a bunch of men. So it was really a very difficult situation. They weren't always playing, in the best of clubs, lots of smoke-filled rooms. So it's interesting because one thing leads to another and leads to another. So that's how I got started on all this. Long answer to a short question.
Hey, those are the best kind of answers sometimes. So I know we have other things in the History Center that relate to Pittsburgh jazz artists. Could you tell us a little bit about where they are in the museum and maybe highlight one or two of them?
So there is something called the Crawford Grill in it's in the innovator section, and what it does is it tries to give you a little bit of an overview, give you an idea of the inside of the Crawford Grill and jazz in Pittsburgh. So there are portraits of some of the artists. There is an actual statue of Mary Lou Williams playing the piano in a corner. There's music playing all the time. There's this great portrait of jazz performers. And there's also a picture of Earl Garner, who is one of the men that we do talk about. And Earl Garner was this fabulous pianist. As you heard, you know, when he sat down to play, Art Blakey said, "No more, back to the drums," because he was so good. But Earl Garner was a very short man. So a lot of times they had to give him a book to sit on to actually play the piano. And one of his really famous pieces is "Play Misty for Me." So if you've heard that, there was a movie and they used that as the backdrop for the movie. So it's fascinating, even in this little tiny area, to kind of get a feeling for jazz musicians. And maybe someday Heinz will do a great big exhibit about jazz in Western Pennsylvania, because we certainly have a wonderful history of it that I don't think people are aware of, the people that, of the individuals that have come from here that play such an important role in the development of jazz over the years. And I think it's important to make people aware of this music because it's not as much in the forefront as it used to be, which is a great shame.
Yeah, it would be great if we could have a bigger exhibit or something else that helps to highlight these stories, because there's so many of them and they're so interesting. So I think we have one more question. Could you tell us, just, you don't need to go into any detail, but could you give us the names of a couple of other people from Pittsburgh who are connected in the jazz story?
Okay, the other people that we highlighted, at least in what we had done for the ambassador program, was Henry Mancini. You may not think of him as jazz, but a lot of his scores were jazz. And of course, Earl Garner and Johnny Costa, who did the music for Mr. Rogers. And he did jazz. So he had little children listening to jazz, which was really cool. And the other, and Maxine Sullivan, who was a singer from Pittsburgh, and Ray Brown, who played the bass. So these are some of the other people that we have. There are little biographies about, and it's interesting because you even saw from when we were talking about the jazz portraits, how these people interconnected. So, you know, somebody hired somebody else for a band who then hired somebody else from Pittsburgh for the band. So there was this great interconnectedness among them all, which is really interesting. So nobody really forgot their Pittsburgh.
Good. So I know we had a question in the chat about how Mary Lou's piano came to the History Center. Unfortunately, I'm not sure about that offhand. That's something that we can look into a little bit more, and we can post maybe in the description of this video or in the chat, but we'll find a way to get that information and to share it connected to this video. And I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that we're having a public program tomorrow night connected to the portraits exhibit, which is where this program got its start from. Because again, all of the people that Judy talked about today are mentioned in the Smithsonian's Portraits of Pittsburgh exhibit. But tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation with Susan Johann, about staging the photograph she took of August Wilson. So that should be really interesting. You can find all of the registration information on the History Center's event page, which you can get to right from the homepage. So I think that wraps everything up for us for now. Judy, thanks again for sharing with us today. And I look forward to hearing more about jazz from you and more from other docents in the future.
Thank you very much. I loved having the opportunity to share these stories.
All right. Thanks again for watching.